Chevrolet Camaro, Cadillac Escalade, Chevrolet Corvette, Pontiac GTO, Hummer H1, Chevrolet Impala, and many more cars that have long become part of automotive history were created under one massive corporation, General Motors, a company that spent decades as the largest automaker in the world, a company that changed the market, pushed technology forward, and quite literally helped shape the American auto industry into what we know today. And today, I'm going to tell you 101 facts about the company without which automotive history would look completely different. General Motors was founded in 1908 as a holding company rather than a regular car brand. The idea was to bring multiple automotive brands under one roof. The first core of GM was Buick. It was around Buick that William C. Durant began building his future empire. Cadillac joined GM in 1909 and later became the corporation's flagship luxury brand. Chevrolet became part of GM in 1918, even though before that it had effectively been competing against Durant's own empire. GM built its strategy around the idea of a car for every wallet. Chevrolet for the mass market, Buick above that, Cadillac for luxury. That became one of the key reasons for GM's success. Oldsmobile spent years as GM's experimental playground, where the company often tested new technologies before rolling them out widely. In 1912, Cadillac mass-introduced the electric starter, dramatically changing how convenient cars were to use. GM created Hydromatic, one of the first mass-produced automatic transmissions, and it played a huge role in America's obsession with automatics. Pontiac originally started as a more affordable alternative to Oakland, but eventually became far more famous than the brand above it. GMC grew out of GM's truck division, which is why the brand is still associated mainly with pickups, SUVs, and commercial vehicles. Harley Earl created a full-scale automotive design department inside GM, and after that, styling became just as important as engineering. GM was the first company to turn annual styling changes into a business model, making buyers want a new car not because the old one broke, but because it looked outdated. By the 1950s, GM was so dominant that it controlled roughly half of the US car market. The Chevrolet Corvette was created as GM's answer to European sports cars, but over time it became America's definitive sports car. The Chevrolet Camaro was created as a direct response to the Ford Mustang, meaning one of the most famous muscle/pony car rivalries began because GM wanted an answer. The Pontiac GTO effectively helped launch the muscle car era, giving GM one of the most important symbols of American speed. The Oldsmobile Tornado became one of the strangest American cars of the 1960s because it was a big front-wheel drive luxury coupe with a V8. GM helped build the Apollo Lunar Rover, meaning the company left its mark not only on roads, but on space history. During World War II, GM massively shifted to military production, building equipment and components instead of civilian cars. GM remained the world's largest automaker for decades, and its influence on the 20th century was comparable to Ford, Toyota, and Volkswagen combined. GM was one of the first to understand the power of brand hierarchy, structuring its lineup so customers could grow within the corporation from cheaper models to more expensive ones. Internal competition between GM brands became so intense that divisions often competed with each other almost like separate companies. By the 1960s and 70s, GM had so many resources that different brands could develop their own engines and platforms in parallel. That gave GM huge technical variety in its prime, but later became a financial problem. GM was one of the first to mass adopt platform sharing, allowing multiple brands to use the same base architecture and reduce costs. Eventually, that strategy went too far, and many GM cars differed from each other by little more than the badge. That approach became known as badge engineering and seriously damaged the company's image. In the 1980s, GM began losing its technological edge, falling behind Japanese manufacturers in build quality and reliability. Toyota and Honda became real threats once Americans realized Japanese cars were objectively more reliable. GM tried to answer the Japanese by creating Saturn, which was meant to become an American Toyota. Saturn received its own dealer network and an almost independent internal structure, which was highly unusual for GM. Despite a strong start, Saturn never became the full salvation GM hoped for. GM bought Lotus cars in 1986 to use British engineers for performance and technology-focused projects. That ownership directly led to the creation of the legendary Lotus Omega or Carlton, one of the wildest sedans of the early 90s. GM owned part of Saab in hopes of strengthening its European and premium market presence. GM also owned Opel for decades as its primary European brand. Through Opel, GM maintained a major presence in Europe for almost the entire 20th century. Holden served as GM's Australian division, adapting American automotive philosophy for the local market. During its era of global expansion, GM had a presence in nearly every major automotive market on Earth. At the peak of its power, GM was not just a car company, it was a global industrial empire. By the 1990s, GM was still massive in volume, but internally it had already begun losing to more flexible competitors. One of GM's biggest problems became its enormous bureaucracy, which made decision-making slow and painful. Many executives inside GM admitted the corporation had become too big for itself. GM was spending enormous amounts of money maintaining unnecessary brands and divisions. By the early 2000s, GM had more brands than it realistically needed to survive. In 1996, GM released the General Motors EV1, one of the first modern electric vehicles from a major manufacturer. The EV1 arrived long before Tesla and the modern EV wave. For its time, the EV1 was an extremely advanced piece of technology. GM never sold the General Motors EV1 directly. The cars were only available through leasing. After the program ended, GM recalled nearly every EV1. Most EV1s were destroyed, causing massive public backlash. Despite its commercial failure, the EV1 developed a cult following. Because of the EV1 situation, many began accusing GM of burying its own electric future. That story was later popularized by the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car? By the 2000s, GM had become heavily dependent on SUV and pickup sales because those vehicles generated most of the company's profit. That made GM especially vulnerable to rising fuel prices. When the 2008 fuel crisis hit, demand for large vehicles dropped sharply. At the same time, the financial crisis hit auto lending and vehicle sales overall. GM found itself in a position where its enormous costs were no longer covered by sales. By 2009, the company officially filed for bankruptcy, ending an entire era of American automotive dominance. GM's 2009 bankruptcy became one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in U.S. history. The U.S. government saved GM with a multi-billion-dollar bailout package to prevent the collapse of the entire American auto industry. After restructuring, the so-called new GM was created, while problematic assets remained in the old corporate structure. Pontiac was shut down as part of the emergency brand cuts. Saturn was also eliminated after the bankruptcy. Saab was sold and soon effectively disappeared as a car manufacturer. Hummer was sold at first, then later revived as an electric model under GMC. GM drastically reduced the number of brands to focus on its most profitable divisions. After restructuring, GM's core brands became Chevrolet, GMC, Buick, and Cadillac. One of the goals of the new GM was to eliminate excessive internal competition between brands. After bankruptcy, GM became significantly more disciplined with spending and product development. The company began focusing more on profitability rather than simply sales volume. GM gradually abandoned the idea of being in every market segment at any cost. In 2017, GM sold Opel and Vauxhall to PSA, ending nearly a century of direct branded presence in Europe. That sale symbolized GM stepping away from global expansion in favor of focusing on profitable markets. GM decided to prioritize North America and China above all else. China remains one of GM's most important markets to this day. Buick sells far better in China than many Western buyers expect. In the 2020s, GM made electric vehicles the centerpiece of its new growth strategy. To support that shift, the company developed its own modular EV platform called Ultium. Ultium became the first platform in years that GM positioned as the foundation of its future, not just another chassis architecture. On the Ultium platform, GM built the GMC Hummer EV, Cadillac Lyriq, Chevrolet Blazer EV, and Chevrolet Silverado EV. The Hummer EV became a symbol of how GM transformed a once dirty brand into an electric flagship. The Cadillac Lyriq marked Cadillac's first serious attempt to reinvent itself as a modern luxury brand for a new era. GM developed Super Cruise, one of the most advanced hands-free driver assistance systems on the market. Super Cruise became a key part of GM's effort to present itself as a technology leader rather than just a follower. GM invested tens of billions of dollars into electrification and battery development. To produce batteries, GM created joint ventures with battery manufacturing partners. However, the EV market proved less predictable than many automakers expected. As demand slowed, GM began adjusting the pace of its EV transition. The company became more cautious about the timeline of going fully electric. GM acknowledged that the market was not moving toward EVs as fast as forecasted. Because of that, the company shifted toward a more pragmatic approach, embracing a mixed powertrain strategy. Despite the EV push, pickups and SUVs still generate most of GM's profits. The Chevrolet Silverado remains one of the company's most important products. The GMC Sierra and GMC Yukon are also among GM's highest margin vehicles. Cadillac Escalade remains one of America's most recognizable luxury SUVs. GM still makes enormous amounts of money from traditional gasoline-powered full-size trucks and SUVs. Modern GM no longer tries to be the biggest at any cost. It tries to be profitable and technologically relevant. GM's story is a story of a company that went from industrial empire controlling half the US market to a corporation that collapsed and had to reinvent itself. And despite every failure, mistake, and crisis, GM remains one of the most influential automotive companies in human history.